davet edeyim hocam. Nina, Marta, to the floor please.
Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to the second session of the day. First of all, I would like to introduce myself without taking much of your time. I'm an agricultural engineer. I'm working at Ankara University Faculty of Agriculture as a full-time professor. And now I am in very mixed feelings here in this stage because during my 34 years academic career, I've been dealing with the milk production and also industrial dairy products, production of industrial dairy products. That's why I don't know how to combine the slow food movement and almost half of my career, because milk production is very important in Turkey, and a lot of people, a lot of farmers are dealing with milk production and the primary production. But also on the other side of the table, there must be dairy companies to produce dairy products to feed the people. Our population is around 86 million. That's why I would like to hear what do you think about the future of the slow foods and the future of the industrial food productions. I would like to introduce our guest speakers. The first speaker is Marta Messa. She was born in Italy and has been part of the slow food movement since 2010. After she coordinated the Gardens in Africa project, Marta opened the slow food office in Brussels, Belgium, as a springboard for the movement's advocacy work. Here, she liaises with European Union institutions on food policy, provides a platform for the Slow Food Network, and nurtures strategic partnerships with international organizations. Marta was elected Secretary General of Slow Food in July 2022. And the second speaker is Nina Wolf. Nina was born in Germany. She leverages her expertise in European and international environmental law as a project manager and consultant for NGOs, including the Environmental Research Center in Leipzig and the United States Pew Charitable Trusts. She became chairwoman of Slow Food Germany in 2019 and specializes in marine biodiversity, food policy, and human rights. We will start with these short presentations of Marta. After that, we are going to continue with the question and answer, and Nina as well. Sorry. You? You will start. Sorry, it's my fault. Okay. Okay. After that, we are going to continue with the question and answer session. Stage is yours, please.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thanks very much for being here, everybody. So today in our seminar, we will outline how agroecological farming can contribute to tackling hunger, poverty, malnutrition, and inequality. So that's quite tough, quite a tough topic. It's quite a tough cost, but we will show you that there's also some sparkling and some hope in this topic. We will provide you first with facts, figures, and political analysis from global studies, and we will then present to you the slow food answer to these problems by agroecological farming as a basis of food systems that put humans center stage, humans as farmers, as food processors, as cooks, restaurant holders, as market traders, and as consumers. And actually, we at Slow Food, we don't like too much the word consumers. We call them co-producers, because consumers, by every act they take in their daily food provision, they actually contribute to the food systems we have, and therefore are as important as farmers when it comes to forming and transforming food systems. But let us be clear from the start, hunger has rightly been called the scourge of humanity. Hunger is cruel and violent and is a powerful plague. And sometimes hunger is even used as a weapon by humans against humans. And that is, of course, something which is completely unacceptable. And at the same time, it's something that is as severe as it is, that we cannot really change. There are no simple answers to these complicated problems. From a political point of view, it is very complex, and we cannot pretend that we have the power or the capacities to tackle hunger. But this should not lead us to despair. And so Slow Food is certainly determined to make our contribution to ending and to bringing hunger to lower numbers, as well as malnutrition and injustice. And of course, we hope that you will join us in our efforts, because you, as co-producers and as people who are engaged in the food systems, you all can do that. Many statistics analysis have shown that hunger could be ended if we just used food in the right way. And that is the contribution Slow Food can make. We can show how food is used in the right way. So I will set the stage for understanding the drivers of hunger and malnutrition, and later Marta will show you what agroecological agriculture can bring about a solution. According to a very new report, the Global Report on Food Crisis, which came out last week, really, there are quite sad news. Acute food insecurity and child malnutrition rose for the 6th consecutive year in 2024. We made incredible progress against hunger between 2000 and 2016. However, in the past decade, progress against hunger has slowed to a troubling degree. The situation is most severe in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, which face rising undernourishment, child mortality, and high child malnutrition rates. We see since 2019 a reverse in the positive trend. It looked like we could decrease the numbers, but now for 6 years in a row, numbers rise again. And the goal of reaching zero hunger in 2030, which was a declared goal of the international community, is quite likely not to be reached. There is a definition of food insecurity by FAO, and I will share it with you. It means that people lack regular access to enough safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development and for an active and healthy life. This can be due to unavailable food or to a lack of resources to obtain food. And food insecurity can be experienced at different levels. So there's moderate food security, where people are not getting exactly what they would need for full and complete healthy diet, and acute food security, severe food security, where people run out of food, and in the most extreme, they have gone days without eating. So in total, in 2024, more than 295 million people were facing high levels of acute food insecurity, so almost 300 million people. Afghanistan, the Sudan, the Syrian Arab Republic and Yemen were among the countries with the highest numbers and shares of people facing acute food insecurity. And let me be clear, these are the numbers of the people facing acute food insecurity. The numbers of people going hungry every day are much higher. It's every 10th person on Earth, and in Africa, where the situation is the most severe, it's every 5th person. I will also give you a definition and numbers for malnutrition. According to the World Health Organization, malnutrition refers to deficiencies or excesses in nutrient intake, to imbalance of essential nutrients or impaired nutrition utilization. And nearly half of the deaths of children under 5 years can be linked to undernutrition. And on the northern part of our planet, you have the contrary. You have many, many children who are simply eating too much and also have malnutrition in that respect, in this other respect. Its malnutrition reached now extremely high levels, including, for instance, in the Gaza Strip, in Mali, in Sudan, and Yemen, where nearly 38 million children under 5 were acutely malnourished across 26 nutrition crises in the last year. In some vulnerable regions, hunger is pushing people to the brink, and at the same time, the world produces enough food to feed all of its 8 billion people. This is a very tough paradox you have to see. And United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres commented on the new numbers by stating that the current food crisis show that the world is dangerously off course. So we're not on track to a healthy population, to a healthy planet, and he calls it the failure of humanity. The numbers are shocking, and when we try to understand, we look for the main drivers of hunger and malnutrition for the why of this crisis. The numbers reflect an accumulation of successive and overlapping challenges in the world, all of which have the severest impact on people in vulnerable circumstances, especially in low-income countries. And some of the most important drivers are conflicts, forced displacement, economic shocks, the climate crisis, distorted and unfair trade, and also not sustainable food systems in place in many regions of the world. So all this drives food insecurity, and many solutions to this lie at the highest political level. They are far beyond our reach. But there are still some examples where we can intervene and where we can do something positive. For example, in the context of the climate crisis, the higher temperatures are making extreme weather events like floods, heat waves, and cyclones more frequent and more intense, with catastrophic effects, of course, on the ability of people to produce their food in the world. And it's always the poorest communities that are suffering the most. And we can fix the root causes of climate change only in a very, very long term. It takes decades to fix this. And we all know that the international community is trying and struggling and making some progress still. But we also have the knowledge how we can adapt farm methods and agroecological practices to provide a short-term relief. So it's important to understand that there are things that are beyond our reach, which are so dependent on political will, on the will to pay direct aid, also they're dependent on international cooperation, and it's difficult to mobilize this whole international community. We work on that in an advocacy in our advocacy endeavors as well as slow food, but clearly this is very, very difficult. But there are also possibilities to fight hunger through sustainable and fair food systems, through reducing food waste. You know that in every household in the world, on average, there are 80 kilograms of food waste. And there's a huge potential to get things right if we tackle food waste. And another example is moving our diets to a more plant-based way of eating. If we eat less meat, we have much more space for plants that go to the direct consumption of humans. We do not have to have this very bad ratio of 5 to 10 kilograms of food going to animals before 1 kilogram of food goes to humans. So I think these are two very practical ways. And of course, we need sustainable agriculture at the really bottom of the whole system. And this is our philosophy of agroecology based on biodiversity. How Eddie explained to you this morning, this is really at the heart of slow food. And I will now pass on to Marta to explain the slow food way of thinking agroecology.
Thank you, Nina. And connecting to what you just presented and also to your question, because I think it's very, very relevant. You said I've been, teaching for so many years about industrial agriculture. How do I reconcile that with slow food? And I think this is a very important conversation to have, because if we want to create change, we need to have this dialogue. And I think the first thing to be clear about is the why of why we produce food. And in that sense, also in my experience, so I'm based in Brussels, and I'm often sitting around the table with the agro industry. So the pesticide industry, the GMO industry, the big corporations taking over the retail sector and so on. We basically are telling each other very different stories, and as to the why we're producing food, and for whom. For whom are we producing food? Are we producing food for people? Are we producing food for faraway markets? Are we producing food for profit? And in that sense, just to give you, two examples, but which again connect to what Nina was just saying now. For instance, in the EU today, about 63% of arable land is dedicated to producing basically food for livestock. And this is not counting the pastures and so on. And we know that we're already consuming too much livestock, and this is feeding into an industrial livestock system. So the question is, why do we need to produce that much, dedicate that much arable land for producing livestock, where we know that, and I know there are nutritionists here in the room, because I was told there are the nutritionist students, that is problematic in terms of diets. Or for instance, in Brazil, basically, Brazil supplies more than 50% of the world's soybean trade from crops produced on 17% of the country's land, mostly GMO crops, mostly GMO soybean, and it's driving deforestation. And the question is, again, why? Of course, if you talk to industry, they're like, yeah, it's creating profit, increasing the gross domestic product of the country, it's creating jobs. But then if you look at why we're producing food, and you see the numbers in terms of food waste, in terms of hunger that Nina was showing, yes, we have, great productivity, but it's not serving the people who are supposed to eat at the end of the day. It's serving other interests. And so in that sense, also to see, okay, how do we get from basically the narration of the food industry to what we're proposing? I think there are some key words that we need to see in a different light. And one of them is productivity. So productivity has been one of the mantras, essentially, of industrial agriculture. We need to produce more yields per hectare. Like that's, we want to always produce more. There is this let me say, race to increase production, which is in some world regions can be a fair concern. But again, if we're looking globally, 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption being wasted, then do we need to produce that much? But even if we wanted to look at productivity, there are some very interesting studies that basically compare industrial agriculture with agroecology, where, and that's maybe the question that I ask here to the audience, for those of you who are not slow food people, had you heard of the term agroecology before today? It's not a test, it's okay if you say no. Some of you have heard, okay. But essentially agroecology is basically considered a science, a practice, and a social movement. And it looks at the whole food system. It doesn't just look at what happens in the field, it also looks at what happens past the farm gate. And that's where it becomes very interesting and where it becomes very slow food, because it's about the connections and the relationships between the different bits and pieces of the food systems and really of society. And there have been some really interesting studies basically comparing agroecological productivity vis-a-vis industrial productivity. And for instance, when it comes to field production, agroecology, as Ina was saying, is based on biodiversity, which is not just the biodiversity of the bees and the birds, which are very strong indicators of biodiversity, but it's also the biodiversity of the crops and the biodiversity of the breeds that we use, where we've seen a huge collapse in terms of the biodiversity in the last 40 years, well documented by the FAO. But agroecology is based on that biodiversity, and that's basically our insurance, like Eddie was saying. It's like in finance, you diversify to diversify risk. In agriculture, you use biodiversity to diversify risk. It's like the diversity in itself, it's a core element of sustainability. And this biodiversity in agroecology lives also through the combination of different crops and species within the same farm. And there are some studies that, for instance, show that basically total output productivity increases with the number of species grown in association and over time. In some cases, there are outputs that are 15% higher than monocultures. And even often less land is required to achieve the same amount of production. Where monocultures, for those of you who are not familiar with it, but basically when we're talking about monocultures, we're talking about big fields where there's just one crop being cultivated, using, very often monocultures go hand in hand with hybrid seeds. So these are seeds produced by the agro industry. And right now there is about 3 companies that control about 90% of seed production globally. And these go hand in hand with heavy use of pesticides and heavy use of fertilizers. And guess what? It's the same companies that sell you the seeds that are also selling you the pesticides and the fertilizers. And that's where, again, it's the why. Why are we producing that way? There are some very strong economic interests. So, and then the issue of productivity is also the stability of the productivity over time. And there again, there are many studies that are showing that agroecological farms have much more stability in their productivity over time compared to conventional or industrial farms. And there's one very interesting example also in terms of this stability and resilience, especially in the face of the climate crisis. So this one study looked at 180 communities in Nicaragua of small-scale agroecological farmers. And Nicaragua was hit, I don't remember which year, but by a hurricane. And basically these farms did much better than the conventional farms because basically through agroecology, they had ditches, they had intercropping of different species, as I was saying. They had terraces, they were doing mulching. Mulching is when you put, for instance, hay on top of the soil to maintain water in the soil. And basically they use legumes. Legumes are super strong fertilizers because they basically, when you cultivate pulses like lentils and beans, they fix nitrogen in the soil, and nitrogen is one of the most important things to provide nutrition basically for crops. And basically when the hurricane hit, and the hurricane is something very violent, of course, but these farms retained on average 40% more topsoil, higher field moisture, and had much less erosion compared to the other farms. And they lost 18% less land to landslides. So also in that sense, it's basically the agroecological practices in the field for a start are making the system resilient over time, which should also be interesting for those who are really, well, also for those involved in industrial agriculture as a way to move forward, because at the pace in which we are treating ecosystems, and not only ecosystems, but also animals and farm workers and workers in the food system, it's not sustainable over time. It's also in the interest of big companies to change if they still want to play a role in 10, 20, 30 years from now, because the loss, we were mentioning now soil, but the desertification of soil due to industrial agriculture, it comes back to the same industrial farms. So it's in their own interest to see, okay, if we do want to maintain productivity, which has been our reason to exist, let me put it that way, for the last 20, 30 years, what do we need to do? And agroecology is showing this way forward. There is more information in terms of also carbon sequestration that can happen through agroecology, water absorption and retention. And I was just discussing this morning with Yasmin, our international council member, that also Turkey is being hit by droughts, as it's happening in many other countries in the world. So water management is key to continue being able to produce. And besides that, there is also the issue of economic sustainability over time. So all that I was saying is also basically supporting the economic sustainability of the farms. And then what I wanted to say is that it's much more than what happens in the field. So again, studies that looked at agroecology and agroecological farms show that agroecological productions based on biodiversity also supply much more nutritious diets, diversified diets. We are in a moment in time where our global diets, if I can say that way, are largely concentrated on a few crops, on a few staple crops like maize, corn, rice. And we have lost also in our diets that diversity of nutrients that are so fundamental to our well-being. To give you again a small example, and I visited this farm directly in Italy, but it's one slow food project called Presidium that is safeguarding and promoting ancient apple varieties. Apple is a very good example of the loss of biodiversity, because in a way, wherever you go, you have 4 varieties that are always there, when in fact we have hundreds, if not thousands of varieties. We have lost many of them, but there are many farmers globally where apples are being cultivated clearly, that are keeping that biodiversity alive. And in this slow food farm, they did this test where they basically saw how the apples were developing over time, depending on the weather, depending on whether there was enough rainfall and so on. But they also looked at the nutrients in the apples. And for instance, those traditional apples had a lot more antioxidants, to give an example, compared to the conventional apples. And it's not just, again, it's really also about the crop itself, but it's about the whole system, because industrial agriculture has converged towards a few breeds of animals and a few crops that are producing high yields, but are void in terms of nutrients, also because they're basically produced to travel to faraway markets. So, they're supposed to be sturdy and look good and look homogeneous because it pleases the eye. But then it's basically making us sick, and indeed, there are many actually illnesses connected to unhealthy diets like diabetes and so on that are really becoming a plague worldwide. I know you asked me to keep it short, so I'll come to a closing, but that connects to another seminar that you're going to have, because I was mentioning earlier also that agroecology is really about also what happens past the farm gate. And in that sense, agroecology is really based on serving the local communities through territorial markets. That can be the farmers' markets, that can be the direct sale of products from the farm, which also means against relationships. It means I get to know who's behind my food production, I get to understand the value of the work that they do. And also there are very interesting studies that basically show, I'm looking here, but the territorial markets are really the ones that are feeding the world globally. And it's often also small-scale farmers. And they do so offering a much wider variety of fresh fruits, vegetable pulses, so much more diversity than you find in any supermarket. This is also documented by an FAO study, but they also do so in an affordable way, at affordable prices. And indeed, one African study found that supermarket prices are 125% higher than local farmers' market prices. So when it comes to poverty, malnutrition, hunger, social injustice, agroecology is really looking at developing food systems that are focused on respecting nature, respecting the people who work with nature, and respecting the whole community, and they're serving first and foremost the local community. And concluding and going to, okay, how do we get there? And Nina started mentioning some of those things. Well, first of all, in our own experience as Slow Food, and luckily there are many other civil society organizations also involved in agroecology, and many others who are doing agroecology. They don't know it's called agroecology, but it's okay. There are so many initiatives globally that are really putting forward this model. And we'll see it on Saturday morning with the Slow Food Earth Market. These are really initiatives that put agroecology in practice with immediate effects for the farmers, immediate effects for the producers and the local communities. It creates local economies, local relationships, and so on. But we also need to have the political move for that change to happen. So universities play a very important role. We're very happy with what the University of Cappadocia is doing, and we know also the University of Ankara is active on this. But universities are where we basically shape the understanding of food systems and food economics and food geopolitics. So I would say it would be great to continue the conversation with you based on your experience, also to see, okay, what does that mean for the world of academics? And of course, we need to have companies move. Of course, there are very strong vested interests there to keep things as they are, because agroecology is basically about dispersing profits to local communities. And big companies are big into profits, so they don't want to lose it. They're very good at trying to keep their advantages. But we should also remember that our governments took already some commitments to agroecology. And so some years ago, the 197 members of the FAO, so the Food and Agriculture Organization, Turkey is one of them, approved the 10 elements of agroecology, which is basically the international agreed framework for agroecology. It's not yet translated into policy. It is starting to be translated into policy, like Tanzania has a very strong agroecology strategy. Uganda is developing one, and that is participating in the working group with the government to develop this policy. But also an invitation to you, being here in Turkey, your government supported the 10 principles of agroecology. Let's hold our governments accountable to it and propose way forward in that sense.
Thank you very much. While you are talking, lots of questions come into my mind. But let's talk about the implementation strategies, because you said, including Turkey, many countries signed the contracts or the agreements for the agroecological strategies or the plans, what do you call it? However, in Turkey, I don't know the other countries, the government doesn't support the farmers, family farmers, if they use uncertified seeds. That's why if you collect the seeds from your ancestors, for example, you can use it, but you cannot get support or incentive from the government. There is a contradiction here. If you want to support the agroecological movements in Turkey or in wherever in the world, you have to fill in the chains without any defect. That's why I don't think the governments are really sincere about that. The industrial agriculture, industrial food companies are very powerful in the world, not only in Turkey, but in the world. That's why we have to find something efficient to combat with this situation. On the other hand, there are 600 million people in the world are named as the family farms or farmers. They are producing 80% of the food revenues all over the world. They are a very big power. But do you know at what level they are taking place in the decision-making processes of the climate change strategies? There are so many farmers, they are directly affected by the climate change, but they have no right or place to say something about it. People are taking decisions and implement it without asking their needs or their opinions, their thoughts. The second thing, the governments are taking some decisions for implementation, and they apply it in the field. In Turkey, for example, a very specific example, to empower the rural community in Turkey, they distributed their animals to the farmers. It's good at first glance. However, they didn't provide any marketing channels to them. At the end of the day, some of the farmers sent their animals to slaughtering. The others sell them their raw milk to the industrial dairy companies. But they are still small farmers. They are still getting the very small amount of money from their agricultural activities. That's why this strategy is wrong. But this strategy has been instantly kept implying since 1970s. Mm-hmm. This is local example. One international example, I've been working with the United Nations FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. I've been dealing with some projects of FAO. I came from Kahramanmaraş province to here directly. I was on the field for FAO project. They implement a farmers field school project. The philosophy of the project, farmers teach the other farmers, or farmers teach each other. Their practices, their production practices, so on. Anyway, the farmer field school's philosophy was set by the FAO headquarters. Without considering the local conditions and needs assessment of the local farmers, they implemented. Did you experience such a contradiction or such a problem in your study fields?
Okay, I'll start. This is all very relevant what you're saying, because indeed, so there are different things to be mentioned here. And yes, we have witnessed this also in our exchanges with farming communities and communities globally. So the fact that Turkey, like many other countries, signed the principles of agroecology is a first step. But we have the problem in many countries globally that is not translated into policies. There is always a difference between the strategies that can stay out there, and we see that many times, and then the policies are at the end of the day what can be enablers of the strategies. On the certified seeds, we're fighting the same battle right now in Europe because they're revising the seed legislation and they want to remove basically the possibility of freely exchanging seeds between farmers, which would be killing biodiversity. So it's where, yes, efforts are needed also by civil society and by farming communities to stand up and say, no, like we need this and this is why it's important, which is difficult clearly because also the agro farming community is very well organized. They claim to represent all the farmers, even though they don't. But I think there is also something to be learned, and I'll refer to something that I heard yesterday about the work that, for instance, happened in Turkey with the Ministry of Tourism to basically bring all 27,000 hotels in Turkey, small and big, to adopt 31 principles of sustainability. Right. There, it was a joint effort, and I know that the University of Cappadocia was also involved, of defining these principles and basically being like firm about these need to be implemented. You need to find the good allies. You need to, of course, to be lucky to have people in the government that listen to those voices and are willing to implement. But and that is why also the other thing that I wanted to say is we need to distinguish between what can happen at policy level, where we need to work on that, but that's not the only way forward. Also because policies take a lot of time also to be implemented. And there's so much change that can already happen right away at the much more local level or regional or like even city or municipality level. So that's why also as Slow Food, we work with farmers, with food artisans, with cooks, with committed civil society and activists to work across the food system, because policies are not going to change culture. They're going to change dynamics. They're going to allow certain things or not. But whether people are sensitive to sustainability and to the importance of food biodiversity, that's a cultural change in mindset, and policies are not going to they can enable that if, for instance, in a university curricula or school curricula, there is a lot more about this, but it's not the only driver. And just going also to the topic of are farmers represented in policy spaces. There are some joint civil society efforts to bring this diversity of voices also of the indigenous peoples, who are, by the way, safeguarding 80% of global biodiversity, to bring these unrepresented voices to the international fora. And then again, international fora, they don't always translate into concrete actionable policy. So we also need to see what is, we need that as well, because we need commitment so that we can keep decision makers accountable. But we need to understand what is the most impactful thing we can do to really change. And yes, what you were also saying about the small scale farmers were given livestock without consultation, and then they had to slaughter or to sell to the big industry. That's not a big problem. But that's why, again, it's so important to work with local communities. And Edward is, again, somebody who can talk about it very well. In Uganda, the government is pushing for basically raising the Holstein cow, which is the Ferrari of the cows, because it produces a lot of milk, but it's not fit for Uganda. And Uganda has this Ankole cow, which is also we're supporting with the Slow Food project, that is fit for that environment, and that it's also connected to a very healthy relationship between the farmer and the animal. The farmers sing to the animals; they really care that their animals are well, and so it's really about giving value to those farming communities. Farmers to farmers exchange can be fantastic and they're very effective. And it's about connecting those farming communities to a healthy local food system where they can sell directly to a local butcher, they can sell directly to a local cheesemaker, they can sell directly to people who understand the value of the work they do. And that's what we're trying in many different ways to do as Slow Food across the world.
Well, the cooperatives are always encouraged as a tool to empower the rural communities. In Turkey, there are so many rural development cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, unions or associations or whatever you call it, but there are so many. But at the end of the day, they have very limited power to empower this rural community. Instead, they are becoming a part of the industrial food production and industrial agriculture production. Do you have any experience in other parts of the world? I don't have any experience, that's why I'm asking. How do you evaluate the role of the cooperatives or the unions, farmers' unions, in the slow food movement?
Yeah, I think it is important to understand that the farmers are facing problems now that are so big, and they get bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. This is about all these climate events that they have to face, droughts, etc. And also biological loss will make ecosystems weaker. And there are many problems affecting farmers. Basically, need a healthy soil. They need water. They need kind of stable water, weather conditions, and seeds. And agroecological systems are much more resilient to everything that can affect an agricultural system, including economic shocks, because everything is so local, and that they, in the end, they prove to be much more resilient. And I think when farmers understand that, they are certainly able to raise their voice and to bring about the change themselves. The question of exchange, of course, of education, and yes, we see parts of the world where this is already happening, like in Africa. And could probably name many examples where cooperatives really function according to these agroecological principles, and they win the fight against the dictate of the industry, which of course also plays a role in many parts of the world. Marta, you want to add?
Yeah, maybe that's indeed like cooperatives basically are at the intersection, if you like, at the intersection. They're in between what's happening in the farming communities and the global markets. And so they respond a lot to the global markets, but that's also where cooperatives potentially could play the role of being game changers. And, you know, instead of feeding the food production back into this corporate controlled, unfortunately, retail system, because also it's a few big corporations that are controlling retail globally. They could be the ones that also had developed these much more direct ways of selling the farm products. We also have the experience, for instance, that cooperatives are represented in the policy spaces in Europe. But at the end of the day, the voice that comes through, it's industrial voice. So if they can be game changers. Nobody needs to be the victim of the global food system as it is right now. It's about taking the ownership and essentially seeing how within each respective sphere of influence, what we can do to move towards a more sustainable way of producing food and consuming food.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think in the EU, we have one example of the producer organizations that we have. And in many examples, for instance, in fisheries, but also in other agricultural contexts, they really, they have brought about a lot of changes back to artisanal practices, because the financial outcome and the productivity for the own communities, the fishing communities, or the farmer communities was so much better. So I think it can be a good system and bring about transformation.
Well, agroecological farming is very valuable, but I'm not sure if we can find the people, farmers, to employ the agroecological farming practices in the future, because in Turkey, the average age of the farmers is 59. That's why the farmers are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and they are deserting the rural areas. That's why this is the major handicap, major challenging point of Turkish agricultural society. What do you think about the rest of the world, in Afghanistan, in Africa, or whatever? You have the same?
Yeah. So, of course, we have very different situations because, for instance, also in Europe, the rest of Europe, we have the problem of an older farming population, and basically it's, the vast majority of farmers in the next 10 to 20 years are going to retire, and generational renewal indeed is now the buzzword in Brussels because it's a big issue. And certainly we need to address it, and it's, if you want, it's even more than it is agroecology, because one of the big issues, for instance, with generational renewal is access to land. It's very difficult at the moment. If you're not coming from a farming family, it's very difficult to get that access to credit. So there are different strategies that need to be devised there. But what we're also seeing, and sorry, just to finish on that, in other countries, it's very different, like for other continents, rather. In Africa, there is a much younger farming population that, though was exposed to a culture where farming was considered the last thing you do. If you fail everything else in your life, then you farm. And that's what, starting with Eddie, but then more broadly with the food, we try to say, no, like you're doing really important work, and it's actually super fundamental for the future of also the local economies. So of course, the age range of the farmers changes depending on continents. But there are also many farmers engaging in agroecology. We launched this initiative called the Slow Food Farms to really support agroecological farmers, knowing already that there are many agroecological producers worldwide, and the same ones that indeed are feeding the territorial markets are often agroecological producers. So it's not like there is an interest or there isn't an interest. There is actually also a tradition in many places of doing this kind of farming. And what is also happening, but I think you'll hear more in the other seminar on youth, it's also, there are many young people that are interested to going back into farming, but in different ways. Like they're also combining maybe the farm production with tourism, so having an agritourism organization. So it's evolving, but certainly it needs to be supported. And finally, also, I think, again, it's not just the responsibility of the farmers or of the individual to take that step. Again, going back to something that I was just hearing about yesterday about the University of Cappadocia and how it started. And now basically, it came from a group, also the whole work on sustainability at the University of Cappadocia. It came from a group that started developing sustainability work. And from there, other work is developing that is having effects on basically these towns where we're staying, because as I was hearing, like the University of Cappadocia is basically the only one that is not in a big city in Turkey. It's very rural, it's in a rural area. It revived a rural economy, it revived beautiful rural buildings that had been abandoned, and it generates an economy where then, those farmers find, okay, I'm being valued in the work that I do. There is a market that I can access to. So that's why it's not just the farmer's responsibility, it's a societal effort to get there. And then again, just looking at the sample of the University of Cappadocia, it was basically the initiative of a group of very well-intentioned individuals with a clear vision that started things off, and the ripple effects are very strong.
Thank you. Well, actually, if you let me speak, and I keep asking questions, but I would like to give a chance to the audience if they want to ask any question to you. Any question? Yes. Otherwise, please.
It's one of them. We call it always like organic farming, ecology farming. So, do you believe that talking about the end customer, like the common consumer, as a common consumer, eating organic product or slow food label product. So, how can we truly address social injustice while slow food is being sold like a bunch in most of the towns?
Go ahead, I didn't get it.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And that's again where we need to have a systematic view, because does it make sense today that organic and agroecological farming and food production is more expensive than the production, that industrial production, that is actually polluting our water streams, making us sick, destroying ecosystems, leading to desertification. So there is in a way, the reason why at the moment the products that are actually best for us are more expensive, it's because there is no support for them on one side. So globally, 90% of farm subsidies go to industrial companies. which are not, again, where the why of the food production is different from the why of the food production of agroecological farms. If we were to reverse that, and if we were to have, like you were also mentioning, Professor Ozer, if we were to have truly government support, for instance, going to agroecological farms, going to the so-called advisory services. So advisory services are basically the consultants who come to the farm and guide you what to do. And in Europe, for instance, advisory services are the ones telling farmers, do industrial, like work in an industrial way, basically, because it's going to lead you to more profits. If the investments were to be into that kind of agroecological production, the pricing would be much different. The thing, and there are two more things that I want to say to that. I think, of course, for the individual consumer, it's difficult and it's not fair to put all the responsibility on the individual consumer. But one thing to realize is that basically when we buy cheaply industrial food, maybe the grocery bill is cheaper than buying agroecological or organic food. But then we're paying it in terms of public health. I was mentioning diabetes. We're paying it in terms of the pollution of rivers and water streams, which is taxpayers' money. We're paying it in any case as taxpayers in terms of the subsidies that go to the industrial farms. So in fact, we're paying, if you put all of that together, it's a lot more expensive than the organic or agroecological farming. But it's fair enough to say, of course, in the daily life of an individual person, the bill you see in that moment is what matters. On the other hand, there is another thing also to say. We're selling often food too cheaply for actually the true value that it has. For the value that it has in terms of the work, so much work that the farmer and the food artisans put into it, but also for the value that it creates for our economies. And I give you an example, a story. I was talking to one of our cheese producers in the UK. And basically he said that there were these these people fixing the street close to Borough Market, which is one of the big markets in London. And they came to taste this cheese called the Stichelton. It's a raw milk cheese, fantastic, traditional and so on. And these were street workers. So we're not talking about people working in finance in London. These were people working to fix the cobblestone, essentially, in the street. And basically, when they tested the cheese, they were like, this is amazing. And they kept going back until the works were done. They basically kept going back to that cheese stall to buy some of that cheese, even though it was more expensive than the other cheese, because even just through the flavors, they understood this is a different story, and there's something to it. So again, it's not just the responsibility of the consumer. We cannot just blame the consumer for not choosing to spend more, but we need to raise awareness, and that's why also at the same time we need to work on policies to change so that subsidies do not go to the big industrial farms and to the big corporations at the end of the day, but they go really to the ones who are supporting healthy food systems for all.
Yeah, and just to add on this, there are so many food policy studies by now who identify food environments as the main driver to change our food habits and our way to buy food. And of course prices are one of the main elements, and for consumers it's so important that prices are fair and that prices tell the truth. That's why many tax systems, mainly in Europe, are put into question, and we see some progress on taxes that more environmentally friendly, ecosystem friendly production systems get a bit of an advantage in the market. And as well, I would like to stress that when it comes to organic and agroecology, that one of the main strengths, in my opinion, of the agroecology principles is that they are quite fluid and that they can be adopted by farmers without adopting a whole system and without having a whole bureaucracy and certification process to pass. before they can say that they are doing some agroecology. So I think that is a big strength. And at the same time, there is no contradiction between organic and agroecology, because it's there's a huge congruence of both systems, and organic organizations actually support agroecology very much.
Okay, any more questions? No. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Nina, for your contributions. And before closing the session, I would like to extend my special thanks to Dr. Sinan Akıllı and his colleagues for organizing this beautiful event and having me here. Thank you.
Thank you.